Welcome back to The Explainer. So if you've ever tried to wrap your head around the concept of sin in Islam, you've probably hit a wall of, well, massive checklists. You get overwhelmed by all these extensive lists of rules. Major sins, minor sins, incredibly complex legal categories. It's a lot. But what if we just completely bypassed centuries of traditional assumptions and looked directly at the original language of the source text? Today we're diving into a really fascinating linguistic investigation to see how the Quran actually defines wrongdoing. We're going to act as linguistic detectives, basically, to uncover a system that isn't based on rigid checklists at all, but rather on profound, dynamic consciousness.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the traditional sin checklist, then move into the vocabulary of wrongdoing. From there, we'll identify the unforgivable state, see how the text prioritizes harm over hierarchy, outline the actual Quranic framework, and finally, contrast compliance versus consciousness.
Section 1. The traditional sin checklist. What theology built versus what the text actually says.
Now, to really appreciate what the source text is doing here, we first need to understand the baseline assumption that so many people bring to this topic. Over centuries, traditional theology essentially built these elaborate taxonomies, categorizing wrongs into major sins, minor sins, sometimes exactly 7, sometimes up to 70. And the thing is, when you create a system like that, it inherently requires clerical authority to interpret it. I mean, someone has to tell you exactly which bucket your action falls into, right? This naturally breeds a mindset of strict legalistic compliance. But the source text? It establishes a totally different paradigm. Instead of some kind of cosmic tally sheet, it focuses entirely on the natural harm and consequences of actions. It's all about cultivating a direct personal consciousness, an internal compass that the text calls taqwā.
Section 2. The vocabulary of wrongdoing, a linguistic deep dive into Arabic root words.
All right, so to truly understand this internal compass, we actually have to toss out the English word sin entirely. It just carries way too much of its own historical baggage. In the Quranic framework, there isn't just one single catch-all word for it. Instead, we have to look at the physical Arabic roots. The most common word you'll see is dhanb, which literally translates to tail. I love this because it's not just some generic broken rule. It is incredibly visual. An act of wrongdoing generates a literal tail of real-world negative consequences that actively follow you around. Think of it like an unwanted shadow. You aren't just getting a red mark on a ledger somewhere, you are literally dragging the real-world consequences of your actions right behind you.
Then we have the word ithm. This root fundamentally relates to slowness, delay, or being weighed down by a burden. So when the Quran talks about ithm, say when it's discussing things like intoxicants or gambling, it's framing the wrong not just as a forbidden act, but as a literal weight. It's a pattern of behavior that acts as a heavy burden, absolutely slowing down your spiritual momentum and holding you back from growth. It's an action that essentially creates massive friction in your life. Another genuinely fascinating term is khatiyah. The root for this one is all about missing the mark. The perfect analogy here is an archer firing an arrow and just totally missing the target. Khatiyah is fundamentally about losing your focus. It perfectly describes an error or mistake made simply because you lacked awareness in that moment. It stems from standard human fallibility. You aimed for the right path, but your focus slipped and you missed. And this brilliantly illustrates the entire linguistic landscape we've just uncovered. Whether it's ithm acting as a heavy burden, dhanb dragging that consequence tail, junah leaning away from justice, or khatiyah just missing the mark completely, notice what is completely absent here. There is literally no concept of arbitrary, rigid rule breaking. Every single one of these roots describes a highly functional, practical deviation from a healthy state of being.
But seeing all these different functional types of wrongs naturally leads us to a really crucial question, doesn't it? If the text uses all these different, specific terms, does the Quran actually rank these deviations into a numbered hierarchy, just like those traditional checklists suggest?
Section 3. The unforgivable state. Identifying the true rupture in connection.
So does the Quran actually list out 7 or 70 major sins? Well, based on our source material, the short answer is no. However, it absolutely identifies acts of immense gravity. Our sources point directly to this exact verse, Quran 4:31, which explicitly promises that if you avoid the kabā'ir, meaning the greater things you are forbidden from, your lesser harms will be absolved. But here's the really fascinating part. The text deliberately avoids numbering or listing them out. It simply points you back to what you are already forbidden from doing, entirely leaving the discernment up to the text itself and, crucially, your own active consciousness. Now, while it doesn't number the major sins, it does highlight one specific, uniquely destructive state, shirk.
The root here, SRK, means partnership or association. And functionally speaking, shirk isn't just some ancient, archaic concept of bowing down to stone statues. Our sources define it much more functionally as placing an intermediary, and that could be a person, an institution, your own ego, or a physical object, between yourself and ultimate truth. It is the absolute, fundamental orientation error.
And the text does not pull any punches regarding the outcome of this orientation error. Quran 4:48 states very clearly that this association, this shirk, is not forgiven while a person actively persists in it. But why? Well, as the source text explains, if the entire purpose of the Quran is to lead a human being to a direct, unmediated connection with reality and truth, then shirk acts as a functional dead end. You simply cannot reach your ultimate destination if you're permanently fixated on an intermediary. It literally blocks your connection right at the source.
Section 4. Harm over hierarchy. How the text addresses specific destructive acts. Okay, so if the text doesn't give us a ranked checklist, how does it actually handle specific bad actions? Well, it absolutely calls out highly destructive behaviors. Things like mistreating parents, taking an unjust life, consuming an orphan's wealth, cheating in your weights and measures. But as our sources point out, these are not assigned some arbitrary score, like, this is a level 3 minor sin. Not at all. They are grouped together strictly because of the devastating, real-world harm they inflict on individuals and society as a whole.
So the absolutely crucial point here is this. The Quran deliberately avoids building an abstract hierarchy. The severity of a wrong in the text comes directly from the actual harm the act causes in reality, not from some external scholarly classification system. If you consume the wealth of an orphan, the text uses incredibly severe language because you are actively exploiting the vulnerable, not because it checks a specific box on a theological spreadsheet.
Section 5. The actual Quranic framework. Building an internal compass.
All right, so if we're totally throwing away the checklist, how are we supposed to actually navigate life? The source material shows us that the text provides a very clear 4-step dynamic system. First up, you have to recognize consequences. Wrongs produce natural effects, right? They produce a tail. Second, you develop taqwā, using your consciousness as your internal compass to avoid those consequences. Third, when you inevitably mess up and miss the mark, you practice tawbah to essentially restore your state. And finally, step 4, you proactively pursue justice and excellence. You strive for positive principles rather than just nervously trying to avoid a negative list of don'ts.
Section 6. Compliance versus consciousness, the ultimate choice in navigating reality.
By stripping away all these artificial categories and focusing entirely on linguistic roots and practical frameworks, we are left with a monumental shift in how one approaches the source text and, honestly, how one approaches life itself. Think about it. Classification systems inherently create a religion of compliance. You just check off boxes, you look for legal loopholes, and you completely depend on clerical interpreters to tell you where you stand with God. The Quranic framework, however, cultivates a deen, a fully conscious way of living. It actively asks you to develop constant internal awareness, to take total personal accountability for the consequences of your actions, and to engage directly with reality yourself.
It is a profound difference, isn't it? One creates a system completely driven by fear and boundary management, while the other cultivates an empowered, conscious, and awakened way of being. So, as we wrap up this explainer based on these incredible source insights, the ultimate question is really left directly in your hands. Are you going to rely on a checklist of rules to dictate how you live, or are you going to step up and develop the consciousness to navigate your own reality?